So welcome back, and I see we have fewer people than we had in the morning. So hopefully people will show up, or they've had enough for one day. Either which way, let's get started. And I think the format remains the same. Feel like this is more of an open discussion because I am not an expert at industrial policy. I want to study them, but I was just going through everyone's details that Kumar sent me, and people have background in understanding industrial policies. It'll be good to get people to jump in with their thoughts. And the way I want to run this discussion or this lecture is just getting thoughts out there in terms of what you think industrial policies are, and we can have discussions around that. So, but just to get you started to think about industrial policies in the Indian context. So this is my plan for today. So I want to first just show you what do we know from the latest economic census, latest as in like, which was still almost 10 years ago. So the latest economic census is in 2012, 2013. So what do we know about firms in India from that census? Then what probably, through industrial policy development over the last 30 years, since 1990, how has industrial policy in India evolved? Talk a little bit about a different aspect of evaluation. So in the morning, we talked about randomized control trials, but given that, as we were discussing in the office hour, you can't really randomize industrial policy, right? So like if you have GST, for example, it's so hard to randomize industrial policies like these. You don't want to randomize them. But can you say nothing about evaluation if you can't randomize, right? And so there is a way if you rely on economic theory. And so I would want to just like build some very simple ideas on economic theory, and this might be a little boring / challenging, but then can you use data to basically inform your theoretical models? And then I think just go through like, where some of the open questions right now in industrial policy are, and what do you guys think are the industrial policy questions that we have? And the last part, which I find very exciting, and this is like literally fresh off the press. So we've been working with a large online job company. Because of confidentiality reasons, I'm not allowed to tell you which one it is. But I want to show you the impact of the COVID-19 lockdowns on how firms have responded to the COVID-19 lockdown. And so we have some latest data that I would love to share with you guys and get your feedback on what you think about that. Hopefully all of this in the next couple of hours. So let's start, right? So just to give you a broad first order view on industrial development in India, or what we call in economic structural transformation. So what this graph is basically plotting is the share in the GDP of the share of the different industry, of the different sectors in the economy, right? So you have agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And so two patterns that you can basically see is this sharp drop of the black line, which is agriculture. So in the 1950s, agriculture was accounting for more than half of our GDP, and by 2010-11, it's almost just over 10% or 15%, right? You can see that services is basically compensating for almost all of it, right? So if you look at the services graph, services now, this is still 10 years back. We can update it to the latest data, but as of 2010-11, services is contributing almost 60% of Indian GDP. Right? And industry actually, though it rises, is fairly flat, at least for the last about 20 years or so. The contribution of industry is fairly flat, somewhere close to about 30%, right? So this is telling you two things. I think one thing that it's telling you is this massive decline in agriculture, which I think is expected as countries industrialize. But then what India's real growth was in terms of the takeoff in services more than manufacturing. And so that's, again, if you know the popular narratives, that's sort of what we see as well, right? With the coming of the Bangalores and the Pune and the Hyderabad of the country. And then therefore moving on to industrial activity and looking at like how does the number of firms and employment in industry and manufacturing look like. So this is data from the different economic censuses that we have since 1990. And so what you can see is both in terms of the number of firms as well as the employment in these firms, right, has been growing over time. So that's not surprising, right? So since 1990, there have been more firms in industry, and there have been more people who have been employed. What is amazing in a way is almost the fact that the number of firms have increased by about 134% over the last 30 years. Number of our labor force has gone up from 72 million to about 131 million. So this is why should we care about industrial policies? If someone is not convinced on why we have a lecture on industrial policy, this is why, right? Because you're employing a lot of people here. You have a lot of entrepreneurs who are working here. And so to understand what government policies and how one should think about the problems faced by these guys is an important issue. This is, again, I'm just showing you different cuts of the data. I mean, this is just to build for people who are well versed with the industrial landscape. I think this is something that would be very familiar, but in case you're not familiar with the industrial landscape, this is something that might be interesting. So I'm just first going to bring everyone onto the same page. Oh, sorry, I stopped my screen share. Yeah. So basically what this is showing is just between the last two most recent economic censuses, which is in 2005 and 2012, right? What has been the growth across different sectors? And the point here is basically to show that, look, some sectors have grown enormously, some sectors have not grown as much, right? So for example, the general index has grown by about 60%, give or take, right? So on average, industry has grown. So again, unfortunately, the latest data we have is 2012. So even if I wanted to update it after that, we'll have to wait for the next economic census to come out to be able to update these data. But if you take the early part of the latter half of the 2000s decade, basically we saw a lot of growth in industries there. But it was, as you can see here, it was very asymmetrically driven, right? So some, especially with respect to electrical and radio, TV, internet communication, these industries grew by a lot, right? Almost 700% or 200% was the growth in these industries. Whereas if you look at, for example, garments and textiles, these industries did not grow a lot. I mean, they still grew by 30%, but they're definitely growing below average, right? They're definitely growing below average. And so the question therefore is, for example, textiles and paper, etc., are places where most of the industrial labor force is employed. Right? So if you look at garment factories, or if you look at all of these paper industries, account for a significant share, and they've been growing below average in a way. Right? And so that again is another cut at sort of trying to examine how industrial policy might be affecting these different sectors. And I'll come to some more specific examples as we go along. This is something that I've been working on and very interested in, which is how does the firm size distribution change, right? So one of the greatest, not greatest, but one of the most active, let's put it that way, the active debates around the world has been that most developing countries have this missing middle, right? So if you look at the firm size distribution, so what I'm plotting here essentially is how many employees does a firm have in India, and this is using the latest economic census, which is 2012. And so what fraction of firms have, say, one worker? How many fraction of firms have 2 to 5 workers, 6 to 10 workers, and greater than 10 workers, right? So if you look at this distribution in the US or in Europe, this is basically empty. In the sense, there are not a lot of small firms. Most of the firms are greater than 10. So you would see in the US or Europe, you would see a huge mass of firms here, right? Whereas what you see and this is not only India, but also what we see in India, which is also something we see in a lot of other countries in South Asia, in Southeast Asia and Africa, is this huge mass of firms who are very, 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 very small. Right. So in the Indian case, for example, if you look at it, almost 55% of firms have one worker. Almost 40% of firms have 2 to 5 workers. Right. So that's the sector that, and as you can already start to imagine, this is also the sector that's not formal. It's not formal in the sense they're not registered with the government. They are, out of all of these, not completely out of it, but they have more frictions and challenges to access government resources. And so that's something we want to think about, right? And just to give you a comparison, below 5 workers, it's about almost our entire firm distribution, right? So 96% of our firms are below 5 workers. Now, if you look at what are the official database that we have from the government that is available, if I want to study industrial policy, I mean, the one thing people use, which is a great data set, is the Annual Survey of Industries, the ASI, right? And the sampling frame of the ASI starts with greater than 20 workers or even 10 workers. If you want to really be technical about it, 10 to 20 workers, right? You can see if most of my workers are below 5, the ASI is really capturing the very, very large firms, right, in the economy. And so that becomes so just in terms of sampling and knowing what is going on. So and that's come to the forefront, especially in the COVID pandemic, right? Where you've talked about a lot of discussion about the informal sector, the unregistered sector, the household enterprises, and, how are they going to be affected by all of these government policies? And that is a real challenge in terms of thinking through industrial policy in the Indian context, right? That is not to say that the large firms are not important. So if you look at the top 1% of firms, right, they actually do employ 20% of your workforce. So it's not trivial to just say, oh, it's just 1% of firms, and why should we care about the top 1%? Well, you should care about the top 1% because they also employ 1 in 5 people in the country. Right. So these are basically the murky waters that we start getting into once we start thinking about balancing both of these things in terms of industrial policies. And then we can discuss a little bit later about some of the things that different governments have tried and what their impacts have been. Yeah. Okay. So then the next question you want to ask is probably, has this? So I in the last slide I just showed you what happened in 2012, but has this been a feature of 2012, or has this been across time? Turns out that, if you work in industrial policy, it's not surprising, but basically this is what India's distribution has looked like for a long time, right? So over 30 years, it's not that so what I'm plotting here essentially, so the blue line is again this fraction of firms that have less than 5%, 5 workers. And what you can see is consistently since the 1990s is about more than 90% of firms who have less than 5 workers. What is slightly worrying is that the fraction of labor force in this, these are the orange lines, right? So the orange line is plotting the fraction of labor that is employed in these very small firms, less than 5 workers, right? Now, ideally, what one would expect is as countries develop, one, that this distribution should go down, right? So you should have more larger firms, less smaller firms, right? And the fraction that's employed in the larger firms should be going up, right? What you find is the exact opposite pattern here. You find that, it's not that smaller firms are any less likely to happen. You have a lot of these small firms. Contrary to development, what you're finding is that the labor that's employed in these smaller firms is also going up over time. So in the 1990s, these small firms employed about 55%. Now they're employing almost 70%, right? And so that is something that is truly worrying from a development perspective of the country. This is again showing you a cut across different sectors. And again, this is showing you, the green lines are showing you the fraction of firms across different major industries and employment. The orange line is showing you employment across these major industries. Again, from the latest economic census. So as you can see, there is this retail and manufacturing basically. So retail captures almost 30% of firms and about a quarter of your employment. And then you have, agriculture, you have agriculture and manufacturing as capturing another larger share. So I think this is not surprising at all. But just to give you an idea of how this is allocated across industries as well. This is something that I've been very, very interested in off late, and I just wanted to get, if people have thoughts or ideas, more than welcome, is just gender entrepreneurship, right? So do we have enough female business women, essentially, as compared to male business women? So this is just a cut of the data by gender. And so here what you see is the following, right? So what you basically see is female-owned firms are more likely to be in agriculture, agro-based industries, right? As opposed to male firms, basically. So there is one that is sorting across different industries. Certain industries have more female firms than they have male firms. The other thing is basically the source of finance, right? So the economic census is a great data set for many reasons. One of the reasons is also because it captures your source of finance. And so what you see here is that males are actually more likely to be self-financed than females. And females mostly rely on informal finance, right, as compared to males. So this has a lot of implications for, government policy that tries to, and there has been a push off late in trying to, a big push for female entrepreneurs to come forward and start their businesses. And of course, one could ask that this data is actually 6 years old and 7 years old, and things could have changed in the past 6 years. But if not, then what this tells me essentially is that females are concentrated in certain industries and they are relying more on these informal sources of finance as opposed to formal. The other part about gender is, so this distribution was across industries and finance. You could look at the same distribution across ownership in terms of size, right? So again, I think where you see the largest the largest share is 2/3 of female-owned firms are basically owner-operated, which means that they have basically one person working in that firm. So these are very, very small firms, mostly household enterprises, if you want to think about it that way, right? And then as you move down, so as you look at larger and larger and larger firms, you see lesser and lesser of female firms. I mean, the fraction of female firms that are there in these size bins is always lower than the fraction of male firms that are there in these size bins, right? So, or to put it another way, on average, male firms are larger than female firms, right? In terms of just firm size, right? And so this is something that we have been working with in trying to understand how important are these barriers. So this is, I've been working with, so Penny Goldberg was the chief economist of the World Bank. So we were trying to work on a project relating to, can we actually estimate? So again, like this is another evaluation, right? So for example, if I were to ask you a question in the morning, like I want to understand how are the barriers, how different are the barriers faced by male and female firms, right? And so what we are trying to work in this project is trying to understand there can be multiple barriers female firms face as compared to male firms. And some of them could be with, say, respect to like fixed costs, right? So the fact that I want to, go through buying these machines to set up my shop or to go through government bureaucracy to register my firm. So there can be fixed costs of entry. There can be fixed costs of registration with the government. There could be variable costs because of social norms, because of other things, culture, or just barriers to just like females hiring workers, right? There could be different barriers in the formal sector. There could be different barriers in the informal sector, right? And so what we started thinking about is, can we actually put numbers on these, right? Because it's very hard to, everyone understands intuitively. If I just show you this data, I think a rational conclusion to draw is that female firms can be smaller than male-owned firms because of a lot of reasons. One of the reasons could be they're facing excessive barriers, right? And those barriers could be along different dimensions. And so what we started thinking about is, can we actually identify those barriers, right? So if I were to ask you this in the morning, you can't randomize gender, right? Hopefully. And so you can't come back to me and say, let's randomize, gender and let's see whether, female-owned firms versus male-owned firms, can we do that, right? And so you can't do that. So unfortunately, or fortunately, what we have to resort to is basically economic models. And the idea, just to give you in a nutshell, and then I can take questions. The idea is basically to say, if I look at a firm distribution for males, and if I look at a firm distribution for females, the difference between that across different sectors, across different formality, informality, etc., that has information in it, right? And that information is basically what we are going to call a barrier. So there could be productivity differences. So it could be the fact that, look, a really simple way, if I'm truly an academic, I could argue that, look, productivity differences are driving this, right? Females are concentrated in low productive sectors than males, right? But then conditional on that. So suppose I take agriculture, right? Let's assume that agriculture is less productive than services, right? But even you have males who are in the agricultural sector, right? So if I look at the distribution of agricultural firms for males and females, that has information inside it, right? So I'll go through the model in a bit towards the end, just to give you a flavor of the theory. But let me go through some very, very preliminary results, and then I can pause and get your thoughts on this. So this is basically estimated or backed up, right? So don't take them as causal estimates in that sense. It's the model-based inference. But essentially what we find is this is across states. On the left-hand side, this graph is telling you what are the fixed costs of entry. Fixed costs, when I say fixed costs, that just means like, setting up your firm, you have to invest some capital, so on and so forth. So based on our model and the economic census data, how large are, so darker means you have higher costs, lighter means you have lower costs. How large are the costs for males and how large are the costs for females, right? In terms of setting up their businesses. And so what you find is, I think, at least let's take for women, right? So what you can see is basically the central states here. So Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, UP, Jharkhand, right? And Bihar to some extent have larger fixed costs for women to get into business. Southern states, as you can see, for females are much more favorable, right? Um, uh, at least from what we can infer from our data. And in the males also, I think Gujarat stands as an outlier, despite popular narratives on how costly is it to set up business for male-owned firms in Gujarat. Though for female-owned firms, it looks much more favorable, right? And again, you see this almost the same pattern, except for Karnataka. You see the same pattern even. So there are certain states that are more challenging just for business, no matter what your gender, and then there are certain states that are more favorable for one gender over the other, right? But this is like that's the power of modeling, and we'll come to like discussing a little bit about modeling. But this is just to give you a flavor of like economic theory can actually help you guide you through some of these modeling decisions. So I think that that gives sort of a very broad set, like a stage that that I wanted to set in terms of like, here is what the firm distribution looks like across different sectors, across gender, in terms of entry registration costs. Now I think let's move the discussion to then looking at some, like how has industrial policy in India evolved over the last, like since independence actually, so over the last 70 years. And so if you think about the role of industrial policy that a policymaker has in mind, it is basically, I think at the heart of everything, what you want to do is you want to mitigate certain quote unquote market frictions, right? So which means what? Like there is inequality. So it might just be that I am the next Ratan Tata of India, but it's just that I'm born in a poor family in a village, right? So in terms of ability, I'm really smart. And if I had the resources, I could, start a new Tata Industries. It's just that I don't have these resources with me, right? So that's what usually everyone has in mind when they talk about market frictions, right? So these could be access to resources like land or capital. It could be access to markets, right? So it could be just the fact that, look, like I'm sitting in the middle of rural Jharkhand and that there is no nearby market that I can really serve in my firm, right? It could be access to technology skill training, or it could be the other way, which is that I need protection from market forces, right? I don't need the IKEAs of the world to come and compete with me if I'm a small furniture manufacturer. Now, what is the problem with this, right? The problem is everyone understands this is what is driving some of these distributions that we see. The problem is, of course, identifying these frictions, right? So if I literally go and survey 1,000 firms, right? How is it that or if I'm the government of whatever state, or if I'm the central government, I have to form a policy that makes everybody, like I want to really target these market frictions, right? But I don't know where they exist, right? I don't know how to measure them. And so what usually happens is you target based on certain observable characteristics, right? So I don't know. So for example, size, right? So India has a lot of size-based policies, right? So if you are below 10 workers, you do something. If you're above 10 workers, you do something. If you have a capital investment less than X amount, you get some benefits. If you have a capital investment greater than X amount, you don't get these benefits, so on and so forth, right? And the reason, or the underlying reason, is because the government thinks that, one way of effectively targeting the fact that I'm really small, right, is the reason that I might be really small is because I have limitations to these things, right? But I think one part which people don't think about a lot is the fact that if you give these, let's call them like policies that are targeted based on observables, you are incentivizing firms to remain small, right? So say, for example, the reason that there might not have been a large growth in the firm size distribution over the last 30 years could be the fact that the small firms just have so many incentives, right? So why would I want to hire the 21st worker if I'm going to lose all of these benefits if I become 21, right? So it's an efficiency versus targeting sort of debate that one needs to think about more carefully in terms of a trade-off. And usually, I mean, which is, I think, the right way, which is that governments usually lean more towards, look, like, sure, there are efficiency costs, but at the same time, like, I really care about these small entrepreneurs and we really want to protect them. And so I want to continue giving these benefits to these entrepreneurs. But I think it's not trivial to ignore these size-based policies, right? The other thing you can think about is spatial policies, and people have started evaluating these, right? So say, for example, like certain states give more benefits to these things. So, for example, like I was talking to someone in the labor ministry in Telangana, and he was like, "Look, like Gaurav, you don't come and tell me like I need more policies for small firms. What I really want to draw in is one big firm who can come into Telangana and employ 10,000 people." Right, the future. So that's precisely what makes this choice really hard, right? If you draw in that very large firm to come into Telangana, right, it's going to drive out these small firms from the market because they're not going to be able to compete with a very, very large firm in the same market, right? You might create 10,000 jobs, but you might also shut down these very, very small entrepreneurs because they're driven out because of competition effects and so on and so forth, right? So that policy tension is really stringent and real. So in that sense, thinking about this more carefully is definitely an interesting, at least for me, it's a very interesting area of research at the moment. Okay, so then jumping into some of the industrial policies that we have had over the last 70 years. So I think the way I've divided this is essentially three very natural breaks in terms of industrial policy. In the planned period, in the 1980 to 91, when they were delicensing India, and then 91 onwards, which what we popularly refer to as the new industrial policy, right? So let's just like quickly go through just so that everyone's on the same page, and then again, these discussions are very welcome. So feel free to stop, add your thoughts, and engage in the discussion. So I think stuff that we still use from the 1950s, this was really the foundation, is like, for example, the IDRA, etc. So the Industry Development and Regulation Act, Licensing Policy Disputes Act. So these were like some of the oldest acts since 1940s and 1950s that are still very, very binding and ongoing even today. In terms of like, how the hiring, firing policies, so on and so forth. And I think the key features, obviously, when they were trying to design it right after independence, was heavy use on state regulation. So they wanted heavy use of licensing to regulate, especially the key industries like the public sector. So in fact, like at that point, the only classification was public sector, mostly public sector, and then others, right? So at that point, there was no notion of really dominant private sector in terms of even the industrial classification. And then they had like barriers for, like, it was licensed, obviously, right? So they had barriers for everything in terms of, for example, something that I've studied in my PhD thesis was trying to look at reservation of products for small firms, right? So this is, for example, like certain products. So people who have grown, I mean, I grew up in the 90s, but like there were certain products that you could only get Indian brands for, right? So like they were very, like, I always wondered why it was the case that certain products, there were only Indian brands and not foreign brands. Turns out there were these reservations that were put in place. There were obviously tariffs in trade. That's I think very well known. So it was a very heavily regulated industrial policy at that point, and which was rational, because that's precisely, if you follow a certain intuitive thread, what you want to do is you want to first give your domestic firms a chance to compete and grow within themselves, and then expose them to foreign competition, right? So that, because you don't want foreign competition coming in on day one and just driving out all industry in your local economy. And that was sort of the framework with which these policies were implemented. Of course, the problem is that if you try and control everything from the state, it gets burdensome after some point, right? And so it's not going to be surprising that in the 1980s basically was when people really started feeling the burden of these licenses and permits that were out there. And so 80s saw basically a phase towards trying to de-license some of these constraints. And of course, like there has been lots of research that has gone into understanding this. And so you have the obvious suspects that are happening, right? So if you de-license, it's going to be good in terms of increasing entry of small firms, encouraging large firms to grow, productivity gain, so on and so forth, right? So states that had more pro-employer regimes grew quicker than pro-worker regimes, and so on and so forth, right? So I think that effect was in a way not surprising. What was really, I think, a key game changer in 1991 was, as we all know, the liberalization of the economy. And so it had basically like three legs in some sense, right? One leg was just dismantling controls, so abolishing these licenses and limiting the public control over firms. liberalization of the economy in terms of trade, so reduction of international tariffs and barriers, and then some domestic reforms, which are like spatial development policies and small scale industries and policies geared towards helping these small scale. So this was like a trio of reforms or a trioca as they call it, of reforms. And so it's important to answer. Now, how do people study it is, I think, a great question. Like in terms of, if I were to write like a research paper or even a policy paper trying to understand how these things, so it's very complicated, right? For example, like liberalization of trade or reduction of tariffs and barriers is something India observes as a country. It's not like some states had barriers which were greater than the other states and so on and so forth. This was a national policy, right? And so if you want to, coming back to what we did in the morning, which is difference in differences or randomization, like it's not like Manmohan Singh randomly picked tariff reductions or something, right? But you do have variations along industries, along exposure to these tariffs. So say, for example, tariffs really went down for some product and all of that product was manufactured in South India, for example. Right? So then you have certain distinctions that you can make in the data, which is, if you're interested closely in this, you should follow or read some of these papers in terms of trying to understand. So these are exactly some of the questions that even came in the office hours, right? So I have this large administrative data set, and then here is a policy that the RBI did, and like what would be a good way of evaluating these policies when you don't have a randomization, but you have some eligibility criteria, you have some exposure criteria. So some areas are more exposed to the policy than other areas, or some products or industries are more exposed to these policies than other areas. So there are ways in which you can build this around an evaluation, trying to figure out, can you quantify the impact of some of these large reforms? And so some of these papers have been trying to do that. And so there was impact on firms that people have studied. There's the impact on labor that people have studied, right? So so what you basically find here is, I think, again, none of this is unexpected in a way. So you find that export-oriented industries, unemployment really goes down. Schooling goes up, child labor goes down. There is general poverty reduction, consumption increases. So it looks like trade liberalization had these, it was really the takeoff in terms of economic growth in India. So if you look at just economic growth as well, you can see it really starts taking off after 95, 96 in the country. And some of that has been attributed to these very large industrial reforms. Right. And so then coming to post 2005, essentially, so in the last 15 years or so, in that case, I think the major policy reforms have been the 2006 MSME Development Act, which basically redefines the medium small. So MSMEs are basically the micro, small and medium enterprises. So these are the very, very small firms in the country. And so there, for example, they have, remember the reservation of products that I had talked about? So so certain products were reserved such that only small firms could manufacture them. And there was a bid to protect these small entrepreneurs who usually were also concentrated in rural areas and so on and so forth. Like jute bags was one of the products that was reserved for a very, very long time. Or palm oil, stuff that is manufactured very locally by these very small entrepreneurs. These things were reserved. But when you're in 2005 and, international firms are producing palm oil and competing with you, then these small firms feel that burden, right? So if I'm a large palm oil manufacturer, or I want to be a large palm oil manufacturer in India, and I'm an Indian firm, I couldn't do that because palm oil was reserved for a very long time. Right. So with the trade liberalization and all of these things, you feel that pressure. You feel that, domestic firms wanted to grow large and manufacture these products, but such laws were essentially inhibiting them from doing that. And so you have some very nice size-based policy reforms that happened in India in the mid 2000s. You had spatial policies, so special economic zones, state-specific promotions. The quintessential example of state-specific promotions, the whole Tata issue between Gujarat and Mamata Banerjee, right, in Bengal, when she did not allow Tata to come in, and then Modi obviously rolled out a red carpet and they went there. So state-specific promotions, taxation policies, which were very, very important. So in terms of abolishing sales tax and moving towards VAT. Now that was very interesting because the whole point of going to VAT is it's the cascading effect that happens in sales tax doesn't happen in VAT. Because VAT, what it does is that you only pay tax on the value added by you. So that has two ways. One, it makes the tax incentives much more compliant. And the second thing, it also incentivizes firms to register with the government. So in terms of formality, it helps because now to claim the input basically that I have purchased, the government needs to be able to match it. Like, if I'm selling something, then I need to, and suppose like, I don't know, like Anirudh is purchasing it, then in that case, like Anirudh needs to say, I purchased 100 rupees worth of goods from Gaurav. So which means Anirudh needs to be in the system, I need to be in the system. And so, there's a whole chain on formality on that. So, and then latest, of course, we have GST and then the implementation challenges that came up with GST as well. And apart from that, there is a whole lot of other policies on technology, skill training, and of course, demonetization that happened and so on and so forth. So again, like trying to see whether these policies are effective or not, there is some research that has come in trying to understand like what were the impact of some of these very large reforms that happened in the last 10 years. And so there are some very, I think, very interesting impacts. So one thing which is underestimated, which I just want to flag here, is the whole idea of general equilibrium, right? So what is general equilibrium? It basically means that, look, if I am benefiting certain parts of that firm distribution, right? Suppose like, let's take large firms and small firms, for example, right? And I say, look, I'm giving an incentive to these large firms to come in, right? So small firms, and if I look at the impact on the economy as a whole, small firms are going to be affected through two ways. One way is going to be through the direct effect of competition, that I'm just competing with a large firm. The second way in which you might be affected is through the indirect effect coming in through, say, changes in prices, changes in wages, because large firms will employ, more workers, they might drive up wages, so on and so forth, right? And so turns out that this indirect effect, which we in economics call general equilibrium, which is like changes in prices. So basically prices of goods, prices of labor, prices of other inputs. Turns out that actually is a substantial effect for small firms, right? So even though the direct competition effect might not be the same. So as you can imagine, right? So people who buy stuff from IKEA are not really the same people who buy stuff from very small entrepreneurs in villages, right? Like a farmer or someone in a village is not going to go and buy stuff from IKEA, right? So therefore, there is in some sense like a separation in market on the goods side. There is lesser separation when it comes to the labor side, right? Because if I go to a city and like you guys are from Delhi, so like Munirka, if you go to, like there are lots of furniture shops in Munirka, right? They are also competing with the IKEAs of the world, right? But the labor that is being employed in some of these is far less separable than the goods market, right? And so therefore, if IKEA comes and drives up the wage for labor in furniture industry, these guys are feeling the heat of that as well, right? Because now labor is just more expensive to hire in furniture because everyone has now contracts with not literally, but everyone is like affected by these large firms coming in and driving up wages. So that indirect effect actually turns out was very, very underestimated until a very recent time. And it turns out that it's an important chapter through which you can do it. The other channel which I have explored in my research is product diversification. That's something that the ASI is very, very useful for, because, and even the NSS informal surveys, because what they capture is product level information, right? So another margin on which you can imagine firms are deciding is not only whether I want to hire more workers or capital, but also whether, like, which products I want to manufacture, right? And so so these policies also have effects not only on through these general equilibrium effects, but also through product diversification effects, right? And so that turns out to be a very important channel as well. And then the last channel, which is through upward downward linkages. So if you look at, like, furniture industry would buy their wood. So you look at the wood industry, furniture industry would sell to, I don't know, some downstream industry or directly to the consumer, right? And so if you change something in the furniture industry, it's not only affecting firms in the furniture industry, it's also affecting these upward downward chains. Right? And so how stringent are these chains in terms of the spillovers into these chains are like, for example, even now with the pandemic, like with supply chains, that was the biggest worry in the pandemic as well, right? So you have to have robust supply chains. Otherwise things, especially in the focus during the pandemic was agricultural markets, like with respect to food moving across space. But you can think about the same thing with respect to industrial policies in terms of like supply chains, in terms of demand chains, and trying to understand how your policies are affecting this. And so, so that was basically a whole set of reforms that I just wanted to show on sort of industrial policies in the last 15 years. And then this was complemented with a bunch of labor laws, right? And so the whole reason I think that people romanticized about was the fact that, look, inflexible labor laws are what is slowing down the Indian economy. Like it's so troublesome to, hiring, firing rules and, all these pensions and this and that. Like, if I want to hire someone, fire someone, it's so painful and all of that. And so that was one of the things, previous research, and now that's been contested. But basically what you find is that, look, if you have very inflexible labor laws, how do firms respond? Well, firms are smaller. They lose, like they have lesser output, labor capital, etc. They tend to hire workers that are more contract. So like, I'm not obligated to many of these laws. But I think the recent development in this is that, firms are smart. Like if you read some of these big industrialists who have spoken in the pandemic or even before that, right? Their point is what? Their point is we are not really constrained by labor laws. They're inflexible. We found a way around it. Right? What we really need help on is the other stuff, which is like markets, which is taxation, bureaucracy. Like all of these things are much more cumbersome than actually labor laws. But for what it's worth, there were some amendments on labor laws as well. And the last thing is on regional like disparities. So if you have seen, for example, Bangalore and Pune, I come from Pune. And when I grew up in Pune, Pune was a very small town. Right? It was beautiful. Now, if you go to Pune, it's unlivable almost, right? And so there are obviously Bangalore, for example, is like my grandfather was a professor at IISc, the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, right? And when we used to go and visit him, it was wonderful to go to Bangalore, right? But now I went to Bangalore and I have lots of issues in Bangalore, but one is the airport being like almost in Hyderabad. It's so far away. But then to get from there to city center in Bangalore took me like 3 hours. Right. And so like there's a whole issue on industrial policies that comes with just regional development as well. Right. So regional economic disparities coming across cities. And, now there is a push for these like 100 smart cities and so on and so forth, which is something that we absolutely really need, because you really need to decongest the large cities. Everyone shouldn't be going to the Mumbais and the Delhis and the Bangalores of the country, where you have like cities like Jaipur and Bhopal and Indore and, all of these like Lucknow, there is this push that needs to be do that. Now, the interesting question from a policy perspective becomes two ways. One is, how do you coordinate across states to do this first? And then the second thing is, what are the right policies that you want to put in place for encouraging businesses to go to those places? So I think that's where I just want to like push the discussion a little bit later in terms of like, how do you even think about this? If you're a policymaker, and many of you here on the talk right now are, that's a really challenging problem, right? Trying to think about these things. But if you have thoughts, that will be amazing to hear about your experiences. So yeah, and so just like concluding that discussion, because I feel I've just been blabbering on for so long, but just to like tie it back together in terms of when we think about industrial policies, what are the key questions, in my opinion, of course, and I'm free to like open to thoughts and suggestions and ideas, is basically what? It's the impact of the industrial policy on what, right? So it could be that there are implementation challenges, right? So it could be, imperfect. As we have just discussed in like 15 minutes ago, there is, I wouldn't say poor quality, but like we could do better in terms of, collecting more data on firms, especially the informal firms. And that's challenging as well as, a necessity. Right. And we don't really have long paths. Someone in the chat box has written already that NSS is, as we all know, like we don't have firm identifiers. So we can't track NSS over time. The only panel that we have in India right now, the CMI is one, but in terms of government panels, it's only the ASI in terms of firms. And ASI, as we saw from the firm distribution, if almost my entire firm, my firm distribution is below 10 workers, ASI is capturing precisely the other part of it, right? Which is firms that are greater than 10 workers. So there is really like some thing that we need to do on just like firm quality data. The second is scale, right? If I want to evaluate these policies, it becomes challenging, because how are you ever going to think about credibly evaluating large national policies, right? These are not very small RCTs that we discussed in the morning. Like it's not like, oh, Pratham going and doing Read India in some schools and not doing Read India in other schools. These are really very large. They're operating at a very large scale. And so, there are these direct effects of the policy, such as, the stuff that we discussed, output, labor, capital, so on and so forth. There are indirect effects that I was just trying to point out, which is on wages, which is on prices. Like how are these going to change in equilibrium, right? So competition, allocation, so on and so forth, right? So when we put together, like thinking through from a research perspective or from a policy evaluation perspective, trying to think about the implications of these industrial policies, these become very, very crucial to have a handle on, right? And so that's where the last point I think becomes very, very important, right? Where researchers can contribute to policy making. Like there is always this debate that, oh, like you go and publish your papers in these journals, who reads these papers, right? That's a fair question. But I think one of the ways where I think research can provide policy insight is through theory. And and theory becomes especially relevant. Like in the morning, you could have told me, if I have an RCT, I don't need your theory, which is true, right? If you have an RCT, you have a treatment group, you have a control group, you have a good causal identification. You don't need to write on an economic model to explain what's happening. Economic models become especially important if you want to go at such large, answer big questions, right? Answer questions at a larger scale where these RCTs are not really possible. So I just want to lay out just to give you a flavor of what does a theoretical model even look like. When we talk about this, I just want to lay out a couple of ideas on that. And this is not a course on economic theory, so apologies if this becomes very technical, but this is hopefully will give you a flavor on economic theory. So if I look at an economic model, so what are you trying to model? You're trying to model two things. You're trying to model consumer behavior. So if I change some industrial policy, there's going to be more production, less production, so on and so forth. But someone has to buy it, right? Hopefully firms are producing it so that someone buys it. So it becomes important to model consumers, right? So, and when we talk of consumers in economics, we talk of utility. So we talk of utility functions, we talk about consumer income, we talk about prices of these products and so on and so forth, right? And so the questions there are, homogeneity in consumers. Do consumers have different tastes? What does their utility function look like in the sense? Obviously, I spend a lot of my share of income on, say, food, but I spend very little of it on, say, buying a car, which is a one-time expense, right? So in terms of like trying to think about these things, income and prices. And the second, so that's the demand side. Then you want to look at the supply side, right? Supply side is what? You're looking at firms. And you want to, when I say heterogeneous firms, that basically means that some firms are going to be larger or smaller, right, than other firms. And they might be affected very differently because of the industrial policy, right? And so here the idea is to basically look at heterogeneous firms, put in some production. This is the model. So you have to make these assumptions, right? And that's the whole part. Like in the RCT literature, like in the morning, we were talking about the fact that, look, if you have these treatment and control, it's fine. You don't need a lot of assumptions here and blah, blah. Here, if you're building theory, then theory comes with assumptions. There's no other way to do it. And so say production functions, what are production functions that might make sense in this? And then the last thing is, how are these consumers and producers interacting, which is the definition of a market. Right. So say, for example, across regions in India, across, the firm bargaining powers that they have with. So do you have monopolistic competition? Do you have perfect competition? So is there a lot of price variation? If there isn't a lot of price variation, that points more towards perfectly competitive markets, right? So which means that a consumer can go into shop 1 or shop 2. I can buy a TV that's Samsung or Apple. It's not going to make a huge price difference. Right. On the other hand, other sectors might have huge price differences in terms of the products that they buy. Right. So in terms of like furniture, for example, there might be a very large, depending on the quality of the table, depending on, who's selling that table and so on and so forth. So like market structures become very important precisely because, say, let's take the IKEA furniture example, right? IKEA is a very large firm that comes into India, for example. They have a huge bargaining power in terms of capturing the market in the furniture industry, which means they can also exploit consumers, right? If consumers are willing to pay their high premium to go and buy from IKEA, then an industrial policy that coming back 10 minutes earlier to what we were discussing on the theory. Let's just power through that and just let me give you a framework of how we are looking at this. So essentially, just to give you an overview without any mathematical equations or very few mathematical equations, this is basically trying to look at, so here are these slides will be shared with you, so you can always look at them later. But here are some papers in case you're interested in how do you want to model firm production decisions and in a economic theoretical sense. Here are some papers that you can look at. But essentially, the idea is going to be to model firms that are heterogeneous in terms of productivity. So it's a theory, right? So now think only in terms of like theoretical models. But essentially, the idea is that underlying all the variation that you see is that different firms have different underlying productivity. So it might just be that I am a really terrible manager and I don't know, like Bhanu is a really good manager, right? So his Z is just much better than my Z. That's basically a productivity distribution that you draw it from. And then based on this productivity, Bhanu and I decide how much we want to produce, right? So Bhanu, so I am the terrible, like whatever, a low Z person. Bhanu is a high Z person. And so like I have to decide whether I want to start my own firm and compete with Bhanu. Bhanu has to decide whether he has got a better productivity. So whether he wants to start his firm and whether he wants to decide. What are we competing for? We are competing for consumers, right? We are competing for goods that consumers are going to buy. And then the consumer side is usually very simple in all of this, right? So consumers, you just assume that what is your national income? Your national income is what your people earn, which is the workers, and what your firm earn in terms of the profits, right? And then, we want to, so just to, again, I don't want to put too much math into this, but essentially this is the point I think that was that was brought about earlier in terms of trying to think about perfect competition versus monopolistic competition and so on and so forth. So one way of thinking about this is, look, you have some broad sectors, like you have furniture, you have automobile, you have steel industry, for example. Within these sectors you have some products. So like within the furniture industry you have chairs and tables, for example. And what this complicated stuff here is basically trying to do is basically trying to say that, look, chairs and tables are imperfectly substitutable in demand, right? So there is some, if I buy a chair, I'm more likely to buy a table, right? But in other cases, the complementarity might not be that strong. And then this is me and Bhanu. We are both producing tables. Sorry, Bhanu, I'm just using it as an example because you're there on my screen, so I can see your name. But Bhanu and I are producing 2 tables. And what this complicated thing here is telling you is, if Anirudh is our consumer, sorry, I'm using another name, but like if Anirudh is our consumer, then Anirudh is imperfectly liking, so Anirudh sometimes might prefer Bhanu, his table, or Priyanka, who's another consumer, might prefer my products, right? So there is some imperfect substitutability. Bhanu's table and my table are not perfect substitutes. And that you can think about more broadly in terms of, say, take tables, but like IKEA tables might not be perfectly substitutable with the Munirka table, say, for example, right? Because of quality differences, because of, say, taste, just the fact that I like Munirka tables more than I like IKEA, so on and so forth, right? So basically what that generates for you very nicely from the theoretical side is a demand curve. That's all you're looking at, right? So when firms are doing what? Firms are producing, so then you're talking of good supply, but I need to pin down good demand, because then we can talk about prices, like Econ 101, right? So demand curves and supply curves. This is basically plotting the demand curve. All of this structure will give you the demand curve. And then what firms are going to do is essentially take that demand curve and produce to manufacture that demand. Some features which are nice about these models, this is to again give you a flavor of the model. I don't want to take very seriously these equations, but essentially the way that you can do this is like Bhanu and I are more producers. We have to pay some fixed cost, which could be, to like all of these machines that you want to buy, so on and so forth, to enter. And then, you can have single products, you can have multiple products. Bhanu and I are basically going to decide how much you want to produce. That's my production function. Right? So in this simple case, I only have my productivity Z and labor as one input of production. You can add labor capital, you can connect across industries, and you can complicate the model as much as you like or not like. So Cobb-Douglas functions, for example, are extremely common. This terrible looking thing is basically a profit maximization. It's very simple once you start breaking it down. All you're saying is Bhanu's decision and my decision is what? Our decision is basically how much are our sales, which is P times Y. How much is our cost of our inputs, right? And my fixed cost. So I'm going to choose my inputs, right, to maximize this profit function, subject to some demand, subject to the fact that Anirudh will have some preference. If Bhanu starts charging him too high a price, Anirudh is not going to buy his good, right? Or if I start charging Priyanka too high a price, she's not going to buy my good, right? So this allows you to sort of build into the theoretical underpinnings of what drives it. And then again, Econ 101 in terms of like, if I give you an objective function and a constraint, you can maximize and find out what the first order conditions are. And yeah. Okay. So long story short, what you will find is, so you are going to find essentially what? You're going to find that if Bhanu and I want to enter, hopefully only if we make positive profits, I don't want to go and make a loss, right? So what is going to drive that? What models like these will give you is that there will be a threshold productivity. Let's call it Z star, right? Z star is a threshold productivity above which you would want to go and enter this industry. And what is that Z star going to depend on? It's going to depend on my fixed costs. So if I have very high fixed costs, then I need to be really productive to go and manufacture in these industries. It's going to depend on my marginal costs. So if wages are really high, for example, it's very expensive to hire labor in these industries, then I would need to be even more productive. Prices need to be, so prices is negative. So suppose like Anirudh is willing to pay a really high price for tables, then in that case, like I need to be even like a crappy producer like me can go and sell a table, right? Because I can get a really high price from Anirudh for it. And then income, the richer your consumers are, the more they're willing to spend on your products. And so, that's going to drive down the threshold productivity, the need to cover my base and costs, right? And so this is basically the underlying very basic framework that I've laid out for you. And now you can go and add all bells and whistles that you want to on this modeling framework, right? And so you can extend these types of models to understanding a lot of these industrial policies. And sometimes it's just good to write down these models and try and play with them, because it gives you real clarity in terms of some of the mechanisms and channels, right? So it can tell you, for example, that if I do X to my model, then the mechanism through which it is going to affect consumers, it's going to affect firms, it's going to affect, Bhanu and me separately. Like all of these channels can be understood very nicely from some of these theoretical models. So that's sort of the merit of using these theoretical models. So as I said, like you can go and add constraints, you can add different types of labor. So people have tried to study like the impact of our trade liberalization on skill acquisition for high skilled people, or even like very, very recently, right? So in all of these trade wars that are going on across the world, like are high skilled people and low skilled people, are they affected very differentially? You can add formal, informal sectors, as I was saying earlier, like with the VAT and the GST, or with now Amazon and e-commerce type firms coming in, is that incentivizing firms to formalize versus not? So what is the implications of models like these on that? And so here again, if you want to go later and read some of these papers, I've listed out some papers for you in terms of trying to think about this. Okay, so I'm going to skip probably the structural estimation, because I think it's a little complicated to explain over a Zoom call. I would have, if I were in a classroom, I would have done this, but it's there. Okay, so then let's move on to like looking ahead, and then I think stuff that I find again very interesting is on COVID. So I think looking ahead, just to tie up the discussion that we've had so far in terms of when we talk about industrial policy of the future, what are some of the things that we are looking at? So one is just this equity efficiency problem, right? So to another way of rephrasing the equity efficiency debate is misallocation. So if you have these larger firms like the IKEAs and the Amazons of the world, they are more efficient, right? So you want the economy to allocate more resources towards these firms. And so that's the across firm dimension. There is a within firm dimension, which is that across, say, products, or across, like the CMI has great data on takeovers, right? So mergers and acquisitions and so on and so forth, right? So that's like, do I merge with my upstream firms or my downstream firms and so on and so forth? So industrial policy is trying to think about that. And the link between economic development and firms, right? So the big question that is still very unanswered in sort of a research debate is, why do countries like India have so many small firms, right? And I don't think we still have a good answer. Is it just about protection? And if it is, then should we be removing these protections? Are there gains from removing these protections, so on and so forth? So that's one, there's just size distribution. The other thing is that even if you're a large firm, what you find is that large firms in India are growing much slower than counterparts in the US and even other countries, right? So why? So why is it the fact that even if I'm a large firm in India, I'm growing much slower than my counterparts? And then there's this thing about structural transformation, right? So as more and more people look for jobs and they want to go and like move from farms to firms, there's a whole set of questions around how is the best way of doing that, right? Do you want all of them to move to kind of cities like Mumbai and Bangalore, or do you want them to, have more endogenous creation of industries there? Is that even possible? So on and so forth, right? Infrastructural constraints, corruption, monitoring, political interference, like all of these political economy type of questions in respect to the so like we have been working on some projects trying to understand the PDS distribution at the last mile, right? And trying to really understand, like, if like we always have this illusion that like bureaucrats, corruption, they need more monitoring, there's a lot of political influence. Some of it is true, many of it is actually not true. And the problem is that we actually don't have good evidence on this. This is all hearsay and guesswork, right? So you're like, oh, no, but like in my department, I don't think this is a problem. In my department, but if we actually look at more of from a central government, if I look at the government also as a firm, right? Why shouldn't it be a firm? It employs people. It produces some services that people consume. So if you look at the government as a firm as well, what aspects of the government functioning are actually quite different from a private firm, for example, functioning? Are the incentives different? Are the monitoring different? Is the accountability different? Are the horizons very different? Is the objective function? So governments are not there to maximize profits. They're there to maximize social welfare, for example, right? But trying to dig into some of these different differences between just like public sector monitoring and public sector operation versus private sector monitoring and operation, I think is an important way forward, given that many of you actually were advocating for more state interventions. The state should go and start having e-commerce tax. The state should go and start doing this. But then, yes, then you need to understand the state as a firm much better. And then, of course, the different types of labor. And this comes back to the vulnerable groups that we were talking about earlier, which is basically, female labor, contract labor. We have SC, ST, OBC, like the vulnerable social groups, for example. We have regional inequalities. And so then how do we actually, and so I have some ongoing work that I'm happy to talk about later on some of these aspects. Great. And then I think if there are some PhD students here, so I just thought let me put it out there in case some PhD students want to pick it up. But some recent things that people have done, like bankruptcy, insolvency, goods and services, like demonetization, I think is now old. There's enough action that's happened after demonetization that can be more constructive and productive. But some of these important industrial reforms that have happened in the last, say, 2 or 3 years, it'll be nice for PhD students to start working on this and trying to understand, can we say something meaningful about the impact of some of these things on firms. Okay, so we're almost out of time, but I still want to show you 5 graphs, and then I promise I'll stop. But this is, I think, really hot off the press, and so I just wanted to show these things and get some ideas in case you want to comment on this. So this is basically looking at the impact of the lockdown on how firms have responded. And I think in India, we don't have really the way I see this is that people have done household surveys, right? We have a lot of even the government as well as non-government actors who are doing a lot of household surveys. Small and medium businesses and large businesses, I think we don't really have it in the public front right now in terms of how has the lockdowns affected these firms. And we definitely don't have real-time data on this, right? And so what we are trying to work on right now, and this is completely preliminary, so this is still work in progress, is to have real-time data where we can answer this. So what are we going to do in this? So what we have done basically is to partner with one of the large online job search portals in India, right? So again, for confidentiality reasons, I can't tell you which one it is, but it's a large online job search portal in India. And so what we are using is basically their real-time universe of job postings that have happened on these there are about 300,000 jobs since January 2020. We're going to track how have job postings changed across about 12,000 firms that post on this. And these 5 minutes are just going to be showing you a bunch of pretty graphs. And so what are we going to examine? We are going to be basically examine how have vacancies or job postings changed, which types of jobs and different sectors. So automatable jobs or work from home and so on and so forth. So this is just to give you where are these, where does the online, most of where the data is coming from. So as you can see, it's mostly coming in from, most of this is coming from the big metropolitan cities, right? I don't want you to go and think, if you know any of these, the Naukris and the Shines and the Indeeds of the world, they're not operating in rural areas, right? They're mostly operating in big metropolitan cities. And that's basically consistent with what we see there. So that's what I want you to have in mind. So who are these people who are posting on these online platforms? And this is just giving you a distribution of what salary distributions are we capturing. So the gray line is what we have from the latest periodic labor force survey in these metros. And then the black bars are essentially what is the data that we observe on our platform. So it's fairly distributed, right? So we're capturing information across different salary, this thing for urban India. Okay, so some graphs which I thought were kind of cool and I wanted to share it with everyone. So one is just how has, so just to make things clear, this dotted line is basically when the week of the first Janta lockdown, right? So it's 22nd of March, we had a 24-hour curfew, and then the lockdown was started immediately after that from the 24th of March. So this week is basically before and after. So if you're looking at before and after, this is before the lockdown, this is after the lockdown here, right? What I've done is all of these graphs, you will see that they have all been normalized such that the average, right, of whatever outcome variable I'm looking at, the average in the pre-lockdown period is 0. Okay, I've just normalized it basically, right? I've normalized it such that the average here is 0, so that then the comparison just becomes in percentage changes. That's easier to interpret. That's basically the idea. Okay, so then what do we find? What you can see is basically vacancy postings have gone down by about, within, I think, this 22nd of April. So within a month, you can see that the vacancy postings have gone down by about like 50% at least. And this is data until the end of May. So we're trying to get like data on June. They still haven't given us the data on June. But basically what you can see is dropping down to about like 60% lower in terms of just, so firms have, and this is consistent, right? So there's hiring freeze across almost every firm. And so this is consistent with that, right? So you can see this sharp fall and then there's no recovery as of now. This is basically showing you the active firms, and you can see I mean, I don't know if this is like, this could also be a trend, right? It's just that fewer firms are active over time. But if you were to, for what it's worth, firms that post on these platforms, it's about 60% lesser firms are posting on average, right? And it's as bad as 80% by the end of May. So as compared to a pre-lockdown average of 0, you have almost 80% lesser firms, 80%. That's a huge, I thought that was like a huge number in terms of like just the impact is basically driven by two industries. One is IT and the other is education and training, right? So I don't know why IT suddenly had, so you can see that all other industries basically have this sharp drop right after the lockdown, right? Literally, I mean, every industry that you can think of. IT and education for some reason have this spike. So education I can understand, probably, like, you know, they're starting these online courses and you're looking for people who can teach these online courses. IT, I guess, is to do with computers. So like with more like IT related issues, if large firms are moving remote in work from home, they might require more like software engineers to come and help them and so on and so forth. So I think it makes sense in terms of like rationalizing why. But as you can see, this was a very temporary blip, right? They still like, okay, so then this is basically showing you the skill requirement. So what I'm showing you here is, so job postings also give you like, you know, what is the minimum education requirement and the experience requirement that I need, right, in those jobs. And what you can see is this was kind of drastic. I think this might be something to do with what some of the points that were made earlier. So what this is basically showing you, the left-hand side graph is basically showing you what is the percentage change in the skill requirement. So how many jobs are saying that they require more of a undergraduate or a graduate degree, right? And you see that that goes up by almost 10%, and it's fairly stable. So like firms are demanding, the conditional on posting, firms are demanding more education from people, and that might just be an easy way to, you know, make things more difficult for workers if they want to hire less. I just ask for more skill qualification, and especially if people are unemployed, you want to get these high skill unemployed people to come and work for your firms. The black line is basically showing you the fraction of entry level jobs, right? So what your entry level jobs defined by jobs that have less than 1 year of experience. And so what you see is, as compared to the pre-lockdown, entry-level jobs have gone down by almost 40%. So if you think about people who are most affected by this, these are going to be people who are young, inexperienced, so on and so forth, right? So first is like, lower educated people are in trouble because now most of these jobs require a graduate or undergraduate degree. And then, you know, entry-level jobs have dropped. So just to give you an idea in terms of like where this might be affecting people the most. And then the other thing is then looking at occupations, which I thought was interesting. So forget the automatable for now. Work from home, as you can expect, right? So work from home jobs go up a lot. And then, you know, but the good thing now is that they have come down almost by the end of May. I mean, I don't know if this spike is just a feature of the data. I want to see June data before I interpret the spike at the end too much. But it seems that they've almost gone down to about 1% more than what they were. So this huge spike, but it's a temporary thing. So it's not like lots of people are, and which makes sense. Like, I don't think India has a labor force that can easily work from home for most of these occupations. And then this, I think, was another interesting aspect, which is basically trying to look at how has the job hit been taken by female dominated occupations versus male dominated occupations. So if you focus on the red line, what this line is basically showing you is that if I classify, so I use the labor force survey and I classify occupations into, you know, every occupation will have a fraction of female workers in them. And I take the very top 10% of occupations, so the most female dominated occupations that we have in the country right now. And I basically look at how has COVID been for them. And what you can see is that female dominated occupations have just like gone down by 80%. Jobs in these occupations postings have gone down by 80%, right? So again, if you look at who is being affected, it's the inexperienced people, it's the lower educated people, and women who are being affected by COVID. Of course, I don't want to make too many interpretations of this in terms of like, you know, what are the causes behind all of this. There might be a lot of causes and we're still trying to iron out some of these things, but for what it's worth, this is what we see in the data. forget the regressions, I think. And so the last point is just trying to look at, like, I didn't show you the one on the regions, but basically you see that north and central states are affected way more than the west and the south. So we seem to be affected much lesser. All industries are hit. So which jobs? I think entry-level jobs and female-dominated jobs are hit hard. And I don't think there's any recovery there at this point, at least from this data. So there might be other data. This might be incomplete in that sense, but for what it's worth. And then firms are adjusting by requiring more skills and requiring more experience in their jobs. So that's how firms are adjusting in terms of their, so just in terms of the broader labor market and how it's being affected. I think these are useful pointers and real-time data to point us towards like which areas we should be thinking about. So I'm way over time, but I apologize for that 15 minutes. But I would just like to thank you all for like staying here and engaging in this discussion. Hopefully, like I've learned a lot from these interactions, and this was a great opportunity. So thanks to like Kumar and the entire IGC ISI team as well for organizing this and giving